cartoons, one I love. Really, I thought it was Publish or Perish. We'll talk about some of the pressures in academia today, what's different today compared to maybe 30 years ago when I started. Now, if we had more time, I'd go around the room and have you each introduce yourselves and know kind of who is in the audience, but maybe just quickly a show of hands if you're a graduate student. So a few graduate students, if you're maybe a postdoc or a soft money researcher of some sort, and then perhaps some lecturers, and then more senior faculty that might have come to hear what it's all about. Okay, so it's mostly an early career crowd, and that's who I'm trying to orient this this towards. Oh, I've lost my clicker. Yeah. Now, why this discussion? If you're early career faculty, you know about, the seeming impossibility of wearing the number of hats you're expected to wear. Teaching, research, service, serving on committees, reviewing proposals, writing proposals, getting papers out, starting up a lab, hiring graduate students, now running a business effectively, trying to keep your group going. If you're a PhD student, there are a lot of stresses as well. And this is something I don't think we talk about in academia enough. This paper that came out last year on work organization and mental health problems in PhD students. It was a survey of about 3,500 Belgian PhD students, and it showed that fully half of them encountered mental health issues along the way in their 4-year PhD. And this is not, I give this talk in different parts of the world. When I give it in the Netherlands, they say, well, it's because they're Belgian. But that's a terrible joke. But, this is, I think, probably characteristic of most PhD programs around the world. The stress is increasing. And part of that stress is that the statistics, the odds of getting an academic job are becoming more challenging all the time. This came out in Nature Biotech a few years ago. The x-axis is time, of course. The y-axis is cumulative number of PhDs awarded, the blue solid and dashed lines. And then the brownish lines are the faculty positions. So I started in 1989 here. That ratio was really quite different to what it is today. Even at the University of Saskatchewan, we're a top 15 university in Canada perhaps, but we're no Harvard or ANU by any stretch of the imagination. We get 100+ applicants to any lecture position. I'm sure it's similar here. So this is something I think that causes stress, an uncertain future, increased competition. So what I'd like to do for the next 40 minutes or so is talk about 4 things that all relate to this kind of successful loop, not a treadmill, but more of a successful loop, and how this can flow more easily, perhaps, for early career researchers. So we'll talk about getting to the launching pad, maybe some words for PhD students in the group. And again, there's chairs down front for those that might have just come in. Just come down. And if you have questions or comments, or you strongly disagree with something, please, let's make this as interactive as possible. Think of it as group therapy at your lunch hour here at University of the Sunshine Coast. We'll then talk about developing a personal brand identity, something I think is increasingly important as we now jockey for position in an increasingly competitive environment. Getting papers written quickly and effectively, that's our number one chore, I think, in an academic setting, beyond teaching, and then surviving these first few years. And what you'll see is that there's really a strong connection between successful work that your students might do, how that leads to successful papers, of course, how that fuels successful proposals, and if it's oriented towards a fairly strong research brand identity that you have, and that you can communicate to others, others can describe you by, this can make life much easier. So let's talk about getting to the launching pad. Now, the reason we're talking about an academic career, because as many of you have maybe heard or sensed, it is a fantastic job. It's incredible freedom. I finished my PhD in New Zealand. I did a short postdoc at NASA at the Marshall Space Flight Center. It was a heady experience, but I couldn't wait to get back to a university. Why? Because it felt like I was working for the man. I was kind of told the area I could do research in. It felt kind of 9 to 5-ish. I didn't like the structure. I'd worked in consulting a couple of years earlier for a little while. I found academia just so exhilarating because it was a level of freedom that few occupations can offer. I still find that all these years later. And this is, I think, what drives a lot of people. I was in Tasmania, actually mostly Kalisha, for a holiday. My wife and I went around in a camper van, and in some of those, on those camper vans, they'd have funny slogans on some of the ones, I think Juicy is the company. They put funny things on camper vans, you might have seen them. And one of them was, find something you love in life and then let it kill you. And it's kind of what academia is in some way. I think they were referring to extreme sports, but there's an element of that, and we'll talk about this as we go along. Really, if you're just starting out, it boils down to two things. Publish early and often, or, and do high quality work, first and foremost. We live in a kind of, increasing tiny chunks of research fragments that we send out for publication. But this combination of high quality work and publishing it early and often is so important if you're a graduate student starting out. Why? Because it's like saving for retirement. If you don't start saving for retirement until you're in your 40s, or like me in your late 50s, you're losing out on the magic of compounding. It's just like that with papers. If you finished in your PhD and you did something in your master's that could be published, get it submitted. Why? Because that will start accumulating citations, and that is the currency that we now live with. And that accumulation is so important 5, 10 years into your career. It's not the be-all and end-all, but it is a very important statistic. Again, going back to Monash, a fairly challenging environment, I think, to be a new academic. Their key performance indicators are, okay, you publish these papers. Now I'll divide each one by the number of sites it got last year. Okay, that's how we're going to stack you up against your other faculty colleagues. That's increasing. I'm hoping that we can move away from that, but that is the current world we live in, especially with the research exercise, or whatever that's called here in Australia, that you've borrowed from the UK in that regard. Something important for students, I think, is this idea that really you need to work on an important problem. And this goes back decades. Richard Hamming worked for Bell Labs. He wasn't a Nobel laureate, but he worked with Nobel laureates, and he was kind of in that milieu at Bell Labs. He wrote a very important piece, you and your research. If you've not seen this, I'd Google it if you're a PhD student. It really helps to kind of understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. If you do not work on an important problem, it's unlikely you'll do important work. I'm going in a few weeks to review the Helmholtz Association. Helmholtz is the main science foundation for Germany, maybe like ARC here perhaps, although they run national labs as well. They're a multi-billion-dollar-a-year organization. Their motto is research for grand challenges, not incremental increases in understanding in some esoteric area of academia, grand challenges, important problems. And if you're a student, keep that in mind as the culture pushes us to go to ever smaller bite-size chunks. So what you're really trying to do is to, and this is maybe not a great analogy sitting here in the tropical or subtropical southeast Queensland, but in Canada this really resonates. You go out to the untracked powder. This is what you're trying to do. You're trying to intellectually get out to where no one's skied or walked before. That's the thing you need to keep front and center, I think, as a PhD student. You're trying to discover new things. You're trying to move the research field forward. You're trying to look for problems that allow you to go beyond the status quo. Now, it's increasingly difficult. Back in 1989, I would go to the University of Canterbury Engineering Library, and I'd sit and wait for the next issue of Journal of Hydrology, this is my field, to come in. Why? Because I was effectively caught up. Journals double every 6 to 9 years. So just imagine over 30 years how many more journals we have. The volume of papers published by these journals also increase in a nonlinear way. But so I was caught up in my subfield. Imagine trying to be caught up now. It's virtually impossible. But the sheer number of periodicals and articles has been an issue for a long time. This quote that you might have been looking at indexes, how many millions of articles per year or per week. This was written in 1950. So this isn't something, I guess I'm sending two messages maybe here, or mixed messages. If you're a PhD student, it's way more challenging now. You don't go to the library. Well, there are no paper journals in the library anymore, but also you're now drinking from a fire hose of information. You're also trying to publish in those journals and have your voice heard. How do you rise above the noise in your particular subfield? We'll talk about that. The key thing to remember, though, for early career researchers, and particularly PhD students, and this came out in Science last year, maybe if someone's on Skype, if they can mute their mic, that would be great. We're getting some noise coming back, if you can hear me. Anyway, this is a heat map. This is again, on the y-axis, or the x-axis is length of time in the career, and that's your kind of productivity axis on the y-axis. Basically showing that you are at your most productive right now. If you're a PhD student, the papers you're working on, maybe the 3 or 4 for your thesis, they're the ones that are going to define you as a scientist in your first, your first years out of the gate. So these are really important times. This is a time, maybe the only time in your career other than a postdoc where you'll have long bouts of uninterrupted time. Look at your lecturers and professors. How many of them sit in their office and read a journal article anymore? They measure uninterrupted time in minutes, not hours. So this is an important time, and maybe a couple of PhD epiphanies that I've been surprised by perhaps over the last decades with my own students. This is one you've probably seen before, often attributed to Einstein, but the idea is that as you move towards an academic, you're turning into an idea generator. And I think particularly in engineering fields, this is a really challenging change to make as you go from someone who can, has lots of knowledge, what equation will solve the problem or size the culvert under the road, to now a research enterprise at a university where it's really about you're an idea generator and you're being creative. I think one key thing for PhD students especially, that a demon they need to slay early on if they're going to be successful, is this one: perfection is the enemy of good. And if you're faculty, I'm sure you've seen students who are perfectionists, and this really, holds them back from getting papers out the door submitted. So we want to do good work. We want to work on important problems, but there's a level of trust to give to your advisor, something that's not maybe fully perfectly shined, to get critical feedback, and back and forth we go. We'll talk about the editing process a bit later, but really this is a key issue to get over. The other thing is how to balance hard work and focus. As a PhD student, you've already demonstrated you can work hard. You wouldn't be in the position you're in. But what I see that really separates those that succeed quickly and those who don't is how they balance this hard work and with a laser-like focus. Because the problem is, if you don't, you can really be a busy fool. You're just busy all the time. I'm so busy. I'm so stressed about being busy, but you're not really gaining traction with any focus. I think that is the key recipe for making quick momentum through the PhD postdoc lecture a few years, is really overcoming this. The last thing maybe is something that Tom Friedman writes about a lot. He's a columnist in the New York Times, and he has written books on this. It's kind of a simple equation. The curiosity quotient plus the passion quotient exceeds the intelligence quotient. And this is the hopeful message, I think, for PhD students. Something I did not think would apply ever when I was a PhD student taking my first faculty position. But now looking back, I see this being so true. It's those who have that passion, the curiosity. It's not the smartest woman or man succeeds. There are other factors that come into this. When I look back on maybe when I started with my cohort and where each of us might be in our careers currently. This is a book you have on your, number 1 on your bestseller list. I found it in the airport in Melbourne as I was changing planes. I won't quote the title back to you, but it has some interesting things, but there's one thing for PhD students you might pick up on. And it's the do something principle. And I think this is often a thing where PhD students kind of get stuck. They think that you need inspiration to gain motivation to then have some desirable action, like write chapter 3 or something like that. Whereas Mark Manson in this book talks about how, well, maybe that's backwards, and it's really just do some action, and the mere act of, you know, getting something on paper will inspire you and motivate you. And I think there's a lot of truth in this. And I see a lot of students who get stuck, or early career folks that get stuck, particularly when they're overwhelmed with so many things to do, that this just doing something can kind of get you going. There's a quote in the book about an author who's published 70 books. And Mark was interviewing him, asking, how did you publish 70 books? And the author said, 200 crappy words a day. So the idea is that, you know, whether he was inspired or motivated, the action of getting 200 words down a day often led him to write many more words, and maybe not so crappy. So that was, I think, a useful point. Let's talk a bit about research brand identity. The idea here is that you're wanting to somehow stand out from the crowd. You're in a sub-area, maybe it's psychology, maybe it's forestry, soil science, who knows what it might be. And you're wanting to come up with kind of your central mission. So if you're a PhD student, you've already had a kind of an umbrella thesis title or question under which 3 or 4 chapters might map under that umbrella. But this is kind of what you're trying to do career-wise. You're trying to, and maybe it's more aspirational early on, but it's the thing you'd like to be truly excellent at and known for. So it's this equal parts of research focus and, I guess, career vision if you're starting out. And what are a few key areas that you want to strive to make a difference in over a sustained period of time? For me, it's been 3 questions for 30 years. Where does water go when it rains? What flow path does it take to the stream? And how old is the water in the stream channel? If you're not a hydrologist, those questions may not resonate with you, but they get me up and excited about what I study still. And I hope for, you know, many decades to come, those 3 questions will still burn within me. That's what you're looking for. You want to make it clear to others how they should define you, help them remember who you are and what you do. So when you go to a conference, you're standing at a poster presentation with some luminaries in the field, you want to make sure that you're communicating your 1-minute elevator pitch, if you like, in a way that really resonates. It's also important at tenure time, this is maybe not so formal here in Australia, but you know, you're going to be evaluated a few years into your lectureship. Random people are going to get your dossier, your CV, your publications. And the first question is, do you know this person? It's much easier to know this person if they've really developed a number of important papers on a topic rather than being a dilettante and flitting from topic to topic all over the field. That's a much tougher row to hoe. This is a great book by Carrie Keller called The One Thing, and it's all about how to make your main thing your main thing. And I think that's a tough thing when you're a new lecturer, you're teaching, you're doing all these things that we talked about at the beginning. How do you keep your main thing, that is papers that relate to your area, the thing you keep whittling away at day after day after day, and not let that somehow fall by the wayside? We'll come back to that. Now, one thing that can help early on in this, especially if you're a student or postdoc starting out, is to think about kind of how you might whittle it down, starting off with, you know, where you fit on this kind of pure to basic research spectrum. Again, some of these examples may not apply if you're in the arts or humanities, but this is a way I think that can be helpful for those in the natural sciences. This is a great book by Donald Stokes I wasn't aware of until recently, called Pasteur's Quadrant, but it kind of helps you think about where you might fit here. This is a great way to also communicate to funders, communicate with your dean what you do, how to communicate the importance of what you do. And this is a first kind of maybe step in your decision tree of how you are talking about what you do, your research brand identity. Then the thing is really to find the, you know, the optimal brand width, as it were. If you go too narrow, maybe it seems a little too trivial or esoteric. If you go too wide, then you're blending in with everyone else. So you're really wanting to give this some thought, and you want to connect to your advisor's brand, but you don't want to move maybe so far away that it doesn't kind of honor your skills, and you want to move in maybe a new direction that takes advantage of what you do. My 3 questions I mentioned, I've had students, one who's a department head at Duke University now, he finished his PhD, he really wanted to work on those same 3 questions. He had some mad GIS skills. GIS is a geographic information system. It's kind of a computer mapping way. He took those questions and then developed these GIS-based models of these hydrological processes, and he's developed a beautiful career around that research brand. So that's kind of what you're doing. You're wanting to separate from the mothership, but not so much that you maybe lose what you really want to work on. The reason why this is important is that one of my students has just taken a job at University of Colorado at Boulder, and she was told in no uncertain terms by her dean that when it came time for tenure review, any paper she co-authored with me would not count. So some universities in other parts of the world really require that complete cutting of the umbilical cord. Not all are like that. Many are much more forgiving in that regard. Now, if you only remember one quote from today or one message and you're just starting out, it would be not this, but this. Only do what only you can do. If you can really deeply reflect on that as a PhD student, postdoc, early career researcher, this will be a game changer for you. I had a PhD student came to me from the Philippines. He had an undergrad in cell biology. I'm a hydrologist. Most of the PhDs are in civil engineering by the time they get to me, or they've had training in civil engineering before they do their PhD with me. He was having an existential crisis in his first 3 or 6 months of his PhD, wondering how on earth is he going to compete with all these civil engineers, because he really didn't have that training. He'd done a master's at University of Pennsylvania and got some geoscience background. And my word to him was, man, embrace your difference. You know, only do what only you can do. Meaning, how many hydrologists know about cell biology? How can you marry cell biology with the hydrology things that we do in my lab? And the first paper out of his PhD was a Nature paper. Now, it's not a definite recipe to a Nature paper, but if he didn't leverage his very unique cell biology skills, I think he wouldn't have been able to achieve that. So only do what only you can do. Maybe you're highly quantitative in a highly qualitative field. How can you bring your MATLAB skills to bear in some area? Maybe you've got an undergrad or background in some other field, and you can import some of that into a new field. That is a recipe for success and to make your path much, much easier. It's doing what you love to do, what you're good at. That's what you're really striving for. Now, after you've kind of identified this brand identity, of course, you're publishing papers that map to that theme. You're structuring your web page around that. You're probably tweeting on those kinds of topics if you're an early career researcher, although we can talk about social media later. But there are other activities, I think, that can really be helpful. A lot of journals now have commentary or perspectives papers. This can really help to show you as a leader in this area, and it's all about leadership early career. What determines who's getting interviewed for a job when there's 100 applicants? It's not just the publications, but it's evidence of some leadership. What sets you apart from the others? What is giving the faculty an idea that you are going to be a future leader in your field? Those extracurricular activities can be really helpful. Going back to this though, publishing a review paper linked to your brand. You think sometimes as a PhD student, oh, how could I write a review paper? I'm just a lowly PhD student. I think that's the best time to write a review paper. One of my PhDs is now an associate professor at Virginia Tech. Towards the end of his PhD, it was clear that on his area of work, he was going after the how old is the water in the stream question. There hadn't been a critical review of that area and the techniques used to quantify those things before. He wrote a review paper. It's become very highly cited, and he was already seen as the expert in that field as he's finishing his PhD. this is something I think few PhDs recognize, that in those couple of short years from ending your PhD to a lecturer position, you're going from maybe student to colleague. And most of my PhD students, by the time they're halfway through their PhD, really it's a conversation among colleagues. And I want them to leave feeling confident, feeling like they're, they're on par with those around them. Editing a guest editing a special issue of a journal. You might do this with your advisor, but this is can be done. Organizing a conference session at a national and international meeting. Very effective step to give you something on your CV that helps set you apart. And the idea is not to just do one of these, but as many as you can. And they all map to this kind of research brand identity you have. To me, this is a very powerful recipe to make quick progress. Let's talk about writing papers quickly and effectively. Again, not a new problem. This has been a problem, or not a problem, but something that a fact that people have bemoaned for hundreds of years. Going back to the Enlightenment, I'm sure. But this is a quote: "Scientist's life would be a happy one if he or she had only to observe and never to write." One thing I've found in my own work and with my students and postdocs is that the structure of a paper, the normal structure of a scientific paper, introduction, study site, methods, results, discussion, conclusions, while that's something of a structure, it's not enough to stop me from writing my way down dead-end streets and cul-de-sacs. So I want to talk just briefly about the top-down approach to paper writing. And this is something that we do in my lab, and I think others do as well. Maybe it's known by different names. But when a student comes into my office and wants to write, say, a paper out of their PhD or their postdoc, I'm pretending to be a big-time Hollywood producer with a cigar in my hand, and they're playing the role of would-be screenplay writer or movie director. And I sit back, they go to the whiteboard, and they pitch me the paper. And the pitch is always around three things. What's the status quo? What's wrong with the status quo? And how does this paper go beyond the status quo? Because what I've observed doing editing work for journals, being an associate editor or editorial board member or reviewer, is that usually a paper gets tripped up when it doesn't have enough of one of these three items. So if you don't say really what the status quo is, then it's really, well, why do we, or what's wrong with it, then why do we need yet another paper on this topic? And if you talk about that, but don't talk about how this paper goes beyond it, then it's difficult for the reviewer to see, well, what's the significance of this, unless you set it against the status quo, what's wrong with the status quo. In my field, probably 40 to 50% of the papers that are submitted to journals are rejected without review, meaning they go right back to the author, sorry, we're not reviewing this. Why? When I talk to editors of these journals, it's because the title, the introduction with this setup, the results, the main findings don't resonate along these lines. That is the surest recipe to have rejection without review. So we go over this maybe in multiple sessions on the whiteboard. They're just talking out loud. They're trying to sell me on the idea. Then once we agree that this is the right setup, and of course, this is really the structure of the introduction, the toughest part of the paper to write, perhaps with the discussion being the other toughest part of the paper. They work on an outline with headings and subheadings. There's no writing being done at all. And when I say headings and subheadings, I mean underneath intro, we have subheadings and sub-subheadings. So we're iterating on this multiple times, and we're doing it, well, to the point where we have the figures as well. We have a 30,000-foot view of the paper, the structure, the headings, the subheadings, the sub-subheadings, the 5 or 6 figures to tell the story. And those subheadings then become the paragraph topics. So you're able to see weaknesses in the paper, that you're able to see if it's really resonating or humming on the right frequency or not at this structural stage. You've not spent any time writing. We spend a lot of time on this. We make writing assignments to co-authors if maybe it's a postdoc or other young researchers are involved. That's a kind of a divide and conquer approach, probably not appropriate to a PhD student. But at the same time, this really helps to get it right before any writing starts. So we're not writing until this is solid, till the subheadings are the paragraph topics, and every single section maps back to what is that single compelling finding that you're trying to communicate. A lot of papers get tangled in mixed messages. This is a way to really align the title of the paper with the objectives. Have the objectives set up by what's the status quo, what's wrong with the status quo, how the work goes beyond the status quo. Have the discussion come back to those same things and have it all beautifully aligned. To me, this has been a game changer, and for my students as well. In Canada, we say write drunk, edit sober. I think this is said a lot of places, probably appropriate for Australia as well. It's a beer culture. The idea is that if you're an early career researcher, particularly a PhD student, don't get so hung up on that first draft. Most of your time, I'd say 10-to-1 ratio is spent editing your work, maybe more. Certainly, we find that for labs or papers in my lab. I've had a student tell me his technique, and that is to, it's a really a rude saying, but vomit out a first draft. I mean, you're really just trying to get something on paper, and then you're editing the heck out of it. If you don't know what editing is all about, this is a great book by Harold Evans. He was the editor of the Sunday Times in London, and he talks about the art of editing. I think academic career track is, you know, you're going to be a writer for life, but it's more than writing, it's mostly editing, I think. And that's maybe something we don't talk about with PhD students so much. And if your English is not your second language, I think this is a way that can really help you with your editing, getting subject and verb up front in all your sentences to make the writing much more direct and uncluttered, if you like. And I found this helpful with my students who've perhaps come from other languages. The last thing on paper writing, I think that I didn't realize early on, but I've certainly found over the years as it's as much psychological as it is mechanical. I mean, I've had times where for weeks I'm beating my head against the wall on some paper, and I take my laptop along with me to get an oil change for my car, and sitting in the car place while I'm waiting for my oil to be changed, oh my gosh, the writing's just flowing. How did that happen? I think when you're just starting out, it's finding what are those moments, those places, the times that can give you that kind of feeling in the moment, that ability to write. And also realizing that, you know, small bursts of focused effort can beat an 8-hour workday where you're like that with your head against the screen. You've probably all found that. But early in your career, you want to find when and where is that? Is it after a really heavy-duty session at the gym? Is it at a coffee shop? Is it changing your location? You've got to find that to accelerate your ability to write quality prose. For me, a lot of it is just jotting down notes when I'm reading the Sunday New York Times or Globe and Mail, or I'm always having a page of paper snippets, a word, a phrase that can help trigger something I might be working on, and I can refer back to kind of re-excite me maybe about some paragraph or paper that's waning. The last thing I'll talk about is surviving these first few years. So now you've done the PhD, you've done the postdoc, and you got a coveted lectureship position somewhere in Australia, for instance. The first thing to realize is that, gosh, time goes so fast, especially when everyone wants a piece of you. This isn't just at work, but at home, maybe you're now starting a family, and oh my goodness, you know, it's really difficult to kind of keep up with all the things. And if you're going up for tenure, this more formalized process in North America, this tenure clock, as it were, really goes quite quickly. How do you deal with it all? 30 years ago, I had no clue. I was an assistant professor at a state university in the US. I was teaching. I was expected to write these research grants, papers, bring in students, all the things we've talked about. I really did not know how there would be enough hours in the day to do that. And somehow I found this course. I'm sure there are ones like this in Australia. In fact, this course, and there's probably 25 like it under this thing called Fred Pryor seminars, they have online versions that you can take at your own pace. Luckily, I found one of these things. It was at a Holiday Inn in Salt Lake City, of all places. And it was a one-day course, and I was in there with accountants and middle managers. There were no academic people in there. But their plight was identical to my plight. Whether they're maybe I don't know, a manager at a car dealership. How do you deal with this onslaught of so many different things? And what this particular course taught me was the value and importance, not just of a to-do list, and we all do to-do lists of some sort, but really a turbocharged to-do list that maps against your objective function, meaning what is that one thing you need to do to advance in your career? And I think that's writing high-quality papers. So the idea was you've got your tasks, but on the right-hand side, you're really honestly saying how long each of these tasks is going to take, and then the next step is to rank them against that objective function that you might have. It seems so simple, but this was like, wow, a cosmic lightning bolt hit me. And I realized, okay, that's how Lee Iacocca at Chrysler, or, you know, I'm dating myself with that one, but someone, you know, gets through this, what seems to be impossible. And the idea is that if these are stubborn and stay on your list for a few days, then you break them down into smaller chunks. And you have a couple of things happen. One is, towards the end of the day, you get to strike these things off. And there's few bits of satisfaction in academia, sadly. We're not like a lawn care professional who cuts a lawn in Mooloolaba and after an hour steps back, looks at the beautifully mowed lawn and admires their work. When do we ever have that in academia? You have a paper you've written, it gets submitted, you've got reviews, it's re-reviewed. There's just never that feeling of accomplishment. Even when the paper's published, you got 2 more on the go. You never have that stand back and look at my lawn, maybe have a beer, enjoy it, bask in the moment. This, you're basking in the moment is, you know, crossing a line out on a, God, that sounds pathetic, doesn't it? But I think there's some truth in that. Also, teeing this up before you go to bed is a great way to not have your sleep clouded by all these millions of things you have to do. There have been studies that have shown the effectiveness of doing this before bed. It's not that you want to have anything work. It's not that you're wanting to do work before bed. It's like you're trying to put work to bed, as it were. Get it on paper, have it there for the morning so you can just leave it there and not be troubled by it in your sleep. If you've not tried it, I encourage you just to give it a shot. I've found it to be very helpful. Now, the main thing is time to write papers. This is a paper you might look at, I don't know, the 1 hour workday that came out a couple of years ago, and the uptake was interesting in terms of outlets that kind of found this approach helpful, perhaps. It's certainly a thing that I came to understand after maybe a decade and a half of not getting papers out the door. And the idea is that how do you get papers out the door when you're got this onslaught of many things to do? And I found that even when I did this to-do list, I'd come home and my wife would say, "How was your day?" And I would say, "Oh God, I got nothing done." And she'd say, "Well, what do you mean you got nothing done? You've been at the office for 12 hours. What do you mean you got nothing done?" Well, I got nothing done that mapped to my objective function, which was getting a paper out the door. You know, I was doing all this other stuff you need to do as an academic. What I found with this approach I call the 1 hour workday is that for me, and I see this in other colleagues, you wake up in the morning. Now, this is condition dependent. I recognize that if you're young and you've got a baby that wakes up before you, there are other factors that can maybe affect this. My kids are now in their late 20s, so I'm not affected by those family activities. But even when they were young, I would try to do this. Get up before everybody else, basically. Make an espresso, eat no food, just feel caffeinated and in the moment. What do I work on? Well, my to-do list from last night said number 1 is this, paper-wise, at least. And I would spend an hour, maybe it was 30 minutes, maybe it was 2 hours before the madness of the day took hold. What I found is that it keeps you in condition, meaning if you leave writing for days or weeks, it's tough not only to get back into the paper, but you lose your fitness. You know, it's like an Olympic athlete if they stop training, you quickly lose that fitness. It keeps your main thing the main thing. So at the end of the day, I come home, maybe I had that same day, but I had an hour at the beginning of the day, that sacrosanct period, and my wife says, "How was your day?" "Oh, it was great. I had a really good work hour when I first got up on this paper," regardless of what transpired in the next 11 hours. And it really helps to recognize that for early career folks, it's these bursts of activity, bursts of when you're in the zone that really can be a game changer. Now, of course, when you're a lecturer and you're now building your own group, it's all about the group dynamics. Now you're inspiring those on your team. There's a guy, Paul Axtell, he travels the US mainly, and he works with academic groups that have become dysfunctional, usually a president and his or her set of deans. It's shocking how often there's conflict in that regard. And he goes and helps them understand what it is to be a powerful group. And he's boiled it down to these 5 or 6 bullets. A powerful group, whether it's at that level, your leadership team at a university or your lab with your own students, made up of people who commit and deliver, respects the individual, handles disagreements, has personal energies focused on the common good, and manages its reputation. One thing, this is kind of what you learn in kindergarten, but it applies so much, I think, in academia, is that this last one, or this one, manages its reputation, is so important. Any talk behind another lab member's back is the absolute road to ruin. Same in a department, at a faculty, in a college. This, I think, is so important to kind of talk about within your group. You know, what are you about? Well, you're mostly about having fun together. Hopefully your 3 questions are the 3 most fun questions you can ever imagine for your research brand identity. You're trying to sell your students on this idea as well. Now, it's not all rosy. You're going to have disagreements, you're going to have breakdowns, but you're going to talk through it in a way that helps you resolve a problem. And if you ever have issues in your, setting in your department where it just seems like it's impossible to communicate, let me say that it's possible. There's something called crucial conversations. I don't know if that's come to Australia or not. I wasn't aware of it until recently. It's used in the corporate world. And basically anything that seems impossible topic to confront, there are proven ways to confront that topic, whether it's at work or at home, but it's mostly focused on the corporate world. So I encourage you to look at that, crucial conversations, if that's something that would be appropriate. I don't know if you see Dilbert Comics. I like this one, How to Interact with Your Students. I need honest opinion about my project. Don't hold back. Your plan looks like it was written by a drunken lemur as a practical joke on other drunken lemurs. Today I learned that people don't like drunken lemur analogies. So the idea is that you're really trying to inspire. You can quickly cripple a PhD student in terms of their confidence and their ability to, perform and to grow as a scientist. And that is one of the most delicate things. And you, as faculty, you may have seen this, with colleagues. Some have that ability to kind of nurture, inspire, and others, it can be quite toxic, where a few words the wrong way, a few drunken lemur analogies, and the poor students are coming out shell-shocked. Maybe I'll end with this one. I don't know if you see this. I've seen this book, Michael Pollan's book, Omnivore's Dilemma. Maybe our academic dilemma is this: work hard, not too much, mostly papers. There was something in the Chronicle of Higher Education just this week. I don't know if you read this, on burnout in academia. It's increasing, I think. I think the stress is increasing too because of social media and all the other metrics that come along with academic life. 30 years ago, there was no H-index. There was maybe a journal ranking, but there were no, academic likes, as it were, like on Google Scholar or other services like that. And I think this really creates stress as well among early career academics. How are you going to grow these numbers that seem to be so important? And I think this is something we need to talk more about. And lastly, about how to say no. I think as you become a lecturer, you're immediately confronted with the need to start to say no, but that's so difficult when you don't want to miss out on something. So this is a very simple matrix that I've been made aware of over the years, kind of the want to, need to axis. And do you want to? Do you need to? And when those want and need really coincide, that's the thing you should say yes to. The rest you should try to say no to. Because, you know, you've probably already found in your early career, you get up to, your nose is just above the waterline. And a lot of that you're getting yourself into because you're saying yes to too many things. How do you say no? This is one simple way to think about how to say no. All right, let me wrap up, and if there's time for questions, that would be great. Again, the hopeful message is that it gets easier. Writing papers gets easier. I have a PhD student on his defense, had a histogram with paper 1, paper 2, paper 3, and then on the y-axis was number of edits, and it went from like 45 to 23 to 10. So he was commenting that, you know, 10 more papers and it only need 2 edits. But each of these things, writing a grant proposal, reviewing someone else's paper, giving a class, this is, I think, the hopeful news for young academics. And I think there's other hopeful news. This is from Ontario in Canada, where I'm from. A quote from our national newspaper that came out 2016. More PhDs are finding tenure track jobs as tenure track professors than previous labor markets have found. A third of graduates with doctoral degrees from Ontario universities are in tenure track positions in the world, half of them working as professors in Canada. This varies a lot. In my area, in water, that's a hot area now. Most go into an academic position. It varies a lot depending on where you are in the university, but this is cutting across all fields. And I guess the thing that keeps me going, approaching 60 and realizing my productive days maybe are behind me based on that heat map you saw on the early slide. This is a compendium to that one from the science paper last year, is that your most important, highest impact paper, really the odds of that are pretty much equal through your whole career. So your highest impact paper can happen, you know, even at the end. It's unrelated to your productive time. This is the hopeful message for maybe the older folks in the audience, but I think I'm the oldest folk in this audience. So just to wrap up, it really boils down to some simple things. A lot of it's time management, how enthusiasm can help overcome other shortcomings, especially early on. How being an academic is really being an idea generator, a writer, a small business owner, if you're now living on research grants. And I think success can be easier if you go narrow. This is a research brand identity. Not too narrow, but narrow enough that you're not just seen as someone flitting about all over the place. This is a great book. Randy Olson was a professor of ecology at University of New Hampshire. He left academia to become a screenplay writer in Hollywood, and he's written this book. He's written a couple of others as well, back to academics, saying, don't be such a scientist, how to communicate. And this can be also very helpful, I think, for early career folks as you try to tell people about what you're doing. And then lastly, there's really a ton out there, and I'd encourage you to seek out some of this if you're interested, and I'll leave that up there. But Kalisha, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much. Remember, it's like group therapy. Mm-hmm.
So as a recent graduate, I wanted to share my experience. So what I did was I quickly go over my previous history because it's relevant. So I did a master, published very well. Then for financial reasons, I went to again I missed research, got back.
Yeah.
Got my PhD in physics, and then did a great project and published in Nature Quantum Information.
Wow, fantastic.
After that, I did from a leftover from a grant, I could get a casual half-time contract to work on parallel bolting quantum physics that I'm publishing now.
Yeah.
But I was unable to get any job.
Yeah.
I was for the past like year and a half while I had that the other contractor keep like applying for jobs, and then I was unable. And this is happening to a lot of other PhD graduates.
Yeah.
So I've learned a lot of things. I knew a few of them already, like working academia. So I learned from other professors. Also, I learned from this. But when this, then academia evolved to this, that they like cheap labor of PhD students and they don't care about where they are going to work after that.
Yeah.
So, for example, in every department, you see like 5 times more PhD students than postdocs.
Yeah.
Maybe you taught us how to fight for that little chance.
Yeah.
Maybe if you're not really mad about science, like research, I'm not saying science, research anything. Why should you like even fight for this? Like,
well, let me quickly comment on that. So absolutely, and I think increasingly universities are running courses, seminars on careers outside of academia for PhDs. Caltech has a huge program. You think Caltech, don't all their PhD graduates go into academia? No, most of them go into non-academic settings. So I think that's one thing. The thing about professors and PhD students and maybe not caring, I think many countries are dealing with that. In Canada, when you apply for the equivalent of an ARC grant, you're judged by 3 categories equally. One is the intellectual merit of the proposal. One is your CV or resume of the last 6 years. And the other is, what are your PhD students doing now? Are they flipping burgers at McDonald's? Or are they academics? Or are they, doing something important in industry or government research? So that has forced the issue to, if you're going to get funded, 1/3 of your evaluation is based on, did you do right by your PhD students? And I think that is a response to maybe some of the concerns that you had.
Again, I think not being able to stay in academia is not the biggest problem.
Yeah.
Is that even outside the academia, there are not many jobs, especially in Australia.
Yeah.
There are less than academic jobs.
Yeah.
Maybe 10 or 15% of people can get a job with a PhD. Others do things that only need the bachelor.
Yeah. I think.
Behind the experience, retirement, savings.
Well, we hear what other people think, but I think one issue is to pursue an academic career often, you're being willing to be an academic vagabond. Meaning, if you're only looking in Australia, even in my field, if that is the only searching space, certainly if you're only looking in Southeast Queensland, probably challenging to get an academic position. And I find with my students, they need to be thinking about a much broader area than just Canada. So I think a lot of it comes down to willingness to sacrifice locationally. There are other sacrifices as well, and it's this constant kind of balancing act, and we need to probably talk about that more with PhD students. Yeah.
In setting your personal brand, which is more important, competition or collaboration?
Collaboration for sure. Yeah, I think if you can develop collaborative skills, that's if I understand your comment correctly. I mean, there's competition in the sense that you can't collaborate with someone and both get an academic job. So it is competition in that sense. But collaboration is everything in academia these days. Interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinary research. These are the buzzwords of academia. And showing your ability to collaborate can be a powerful and important thing on your resume as you're trying to get an academic job. Yeah. I mean, I think I know where you're coming from. After my assistant professor at State University in the US, my wife was really homesick, so we moved somewhere closer to Toronto, but still within the US. And I had a job offer from a state school in Syracuse, New York. And then just before I'm accepting that job, I got a call from Princeton to interview in their civil engineering department. And it was like, wow, I gotta at least go and interview there and see what it's like. And man, it was disgusting. It felt like people just clawed over each other to get to the top. It wasn't collaboration in any way, shape, or form. And I found that so off-putting. I rerouted my flight home, signed on the dotted line with Syracuse, and thanked my lucky stars. Not that Princeton would have necessarily offered me a job. So I think in that respect, absolutely, collaboration is a much more harmonious, you know, way to proceed. Yeah. 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 Because the cycle can work the other way as well. If you're fortunate with grant success, that can then, you know, alleviate some coursework, because now you're seen as someone who can bring in money, and, you know, there's a positive feedback that maybe balances the negative feedback you might have seen with a colleague of yours. Oof, I don't know. These are not easy black and white answers. Again, research grants are a funny thing. When I first started writing grants to the National Science Foundation, I wanted to work on a topic linked to my PhD. I could not, for the life of me, get anything funded in that regard. I would have been beating my head against the wall for years after a couple of grants showed me that's not something that's going to get funded. So I found another area to try to, so it's always, you know, trying to be somewhat flexible, not lose sight of what your thing is, your main thing, but at the same time, you can't flog a dead horse in that regard. There's no easy answer, though, to your question. Yeah. All right, Kalisha, I think we've depressed them all.